we can at least ask whether or to what extent the policies of our times have contributed to these problems of our time. Looking ahead to the future, one of the things that we need to focus on are facts about results, not rhetoric about intentions. We need to look not at the noble preambles of legislation, but at the incentives created in that legislation. Very often legislation intended to help the disadvantaged, in fact, pay people to stay disadvantaged, penalize them to the extent that they make an effort to rise from disadvantage.
You can't stand self-pity. Is that part of what's going on here?
Partly, yeah.
And somehow or other, the liberal project plays on pity.
Yes.
But those of us who watched President Trump's State of the Union address will remember the moment when he announced in the chamber that the black unemployment rate had now fallen to the lowest point since records for black unemployment had begun to be kept. That is how the economy, quickly the economy had begun to grow again in the recent couple of quarters. Black unemployment lowest since the records began to be kept. And the Democratic side of the chamber sat on its hands. The Republicans applauded, but the Democrats sat on their hands, and there were some close-ups on camera, and not only did they sit on their hands, they all looked as though they just sucked on a lemon.
African American, Hispanic American, and Asian American unemployment have all reached their lowest levels ever recorded. And something I'm very proud of, African American unemployment stands at the lowest rate ever recorded. And Hispanic American unemployment has also reached the lowest levels in history.
What on earth is going on? What's going on there?
Oh, it will take a wiser man than me to explain all of that. But I will say that people have a vested interest in black victimhood. I mean, without black victimhood, you cannot get the black turnout, and the Democrats would lose a lot of elections. So they must constantly push this.
Nicholas Kristof, columnist for the New York Times, got under your skin, and not for the first time. Readers of your column will know. New York Times writer Nicholas Kristof, I'm quoting you, asserts that there is you're quoting him, overwhelming evidence that centuries of racial subjugation still shape inequity in the 21st century, quote, closing quote, and he mentions, open quote, the lingering effects of slavery, close quote. And now this is Tom Sowell. If we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, in 1960, which would be almost 100 years after the end of slavery, 22% of black kids grew up in homes with only one parent.
Just 22%?
Yes.
4 out of 5 were in homes with both parents?
Yes. 30 years later, after the liberal welfare state, that number had more than tripled. And so I said, well, let us compare, if we can speculate on how much that 22% was due to the legacy of slavery. But we know that tripling was not due to the legacy of slavery. It was due to the legacy of a whole different set of policies. And you can look at it so many other ways. Education. Stuyvesant High School in New York, as you know, you get into only by passing a very tough exam. In 2012, the percentage of black students who had gotten into Stuyvesant High School was less than 1/10 of the percentage of black students who had gotten into Stuyvesant High School 33 years earlier.
I didn't know that.
There's Dunbar High School in Washington, which was an elite black high school for a very long time. In 1993, the number of kids out of Dunbar High School who went on to college was less than it was 60 years earlier, which would have been in the depth of the Great Depression. And so you can run through a whole bunch of other things like that. Look at the housing projects. The housing projects in the first half of the 20th century, during that first 100 years after slavery, did not have the high crime rates, the murder rates, the graffiti, all the rest of it we associate. None of that was there. People, like the New York Times, Christoph should read his own old papers, pointed out that on Saturday mornings, it was common in the housing project of this earlier era for parents to leave their doors unlocked because some of the parents could afford television, some couldn't. So the ones who had television would leave their doors unlocked, and the kids from the other families could come down there and watch television with them. Well, now the latest figures show that most people below the poverty line have 2 television sets and cable, but they wouldn't dare leave their doors unlocked in a public housing project.
And liberals have wreaked more havoc on blacks than the supposed legacy of slavery they talk about.
Yes.
You don't mean that hyperbolically.
No, I do not.
You mean it.
Yeah, and another thing, crime and violence. Now we take it for granted that there's tremendous levels of crime and violence in the black community. That was not always the case. In the 20s, it was very common for white celebrities, including George Gershwin and William Faulkner, to go up to Harlem not only for entertainment places, but to go into private homes of people they knew. And Gershwin played Rhapsody in Blue in this home where Walter White lived. Milton Friedman, when he was a graduate student at Columbia, he and the lady he later married would go dancing at the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. And he said, we had no fear of being mugged or accosted on the street or anything like that.
I've heard you say, Tom, when you were a boy growing up in Harlem yourself, your own neighborhood felt totally safe to you.
Not totally safe. I wouldn't exaggerate, but there's nothing resembling today. I mean, I did sleep on hot nights. I would sleep out on the fire escape. When I tell people in Harlem that today, they think I'm from another galaxy, you know. But that people slept on the fire escapes in New York and in the public parks in the 30s, all over the city, because it was not a jungle. There was a lady. One other example. There was a woman who was a black woman in Harlem who was an actress. She'd go down to the theater district, and then after the play, they'd have their drinks and eat something or whatever. And she said at 1 o'clock in the morning, she would simply get on the subway and go on up to Harlem and walk home from there. Now, it so happens that the subway station she got off at was very near a grocery store where I was a delivery boy. And on Saturday nights, I would be working usually until around midnight. And when I would go home, I would go past that very same subway station she's talking about. I never had the slightest trouble. There's no mystery to me as to why Jesse Jackson says what he does, or Al Sharpton and others, because that benefits them, but it does not benefit the people they lead. And all the incentives are for leaders to lead people into things that don't help the people, but help the leaders. And in fact, in the book that I'm writing now, I discover this is true not only in the United States, it's true in England, and the situation is wholly different. And yet, if you read the data, for example, from London, the educational tests and so forth, you see that there, immigrants from Africa pass this test they have. I'm talking about low-income people now. Nearly 60% of the time. Blacks from the Caribbean, like 50%, so on. Native-born whites in the same low-income bracket pass this test 30% of the time. And it's the same thing. The foreign people come in, they haven't had generations of being steeped in the welfare state vision the vision of grievances, victimology, and resentments, the idea that there are enemies out there dedicated to keeping you down. That's the message that's been pumped into the head of the white lower class in Britain, and that's the image that's been pumped into the black low-income people in the United States, and the results are the same in both cases.
What would Sterling Allen Brown want to say to Al Sharpton and the protesters in Ferguson today?
I don't know.
What would you say to them, to Al Sharpton and?
Well, I'm sure it couldn't be repeated on television, but I would say nothing actually.
Why is that?
I am sure that Jesse Jackson makes 10 times as much money a year as I do. And I don't think I should take on the project of convincing somebody to reduce his income by 90%.
I think that if insofar as we're going to enlist the intelligence, the desires, and the commitments of blacks themselves, we have to do so by offering more choice in more areas, to let them decide what is best for themselves and not to turn that job over to academics and government officials. Thank you.